to our book talk lecture series. This is a special book talk lecture today that we are hosting. My name is Jisoo Kim. I'm the director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies and the Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and Research in Languages and Literatures. We are very delighted to have Dr. Koh with us today to give her book talk. Let me introduce Dr. Koh before I invite her to the podium. Dr. Dong-Yeon Koh is an art critic and has served as a mentor and committee member in art residences and museums in South Korea over the last 2 decades. She's also currently an adjunct lecturer at Seoul National University. And she was the commissioner of the Korean Outdoor Sculpture Festival and served as the managing committee of AOT Cinema and Media Festival, and she has also published more than 40 academic essays in journals, as well as she also has book publications. And one of some of the recent book publications include From Soft Power to Goods, Alternative Forms of Exhibitions and Populist Artistic Practices in Post-1990s East Asian Art, published by Seoul Press, 2018, and The Condition for Art Criticism, published by the same press, 2019, and more recently, Korean War and Postmemory Generation, The Arts and Films in South Korea, published by Routledge, 2021, which is going to be the focus of our talk today. All right, so without further ado, let me invite Dr. Koh.
My name is Dong-Yeon Koh, and I definitely was really grateful of the Institute as well as the audiences to have a chance for me to introduce about my books. The book is a theoretical book targeted for graduate school students. That in this talk, I kind of more bring general perspective about how artists and filmmakers in post-war generations react to those circumstances in which, and I really introduced the 13 artists and filmmakers. Korean War has been gotten attention of the American public, certainly compared to the one preceding, like a Second World War, and one following, such as the Vietnam War. And the contexts are a bit different, but contemporary Koreans are equally least mindful of Korean War. The exhibition at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Korean Art on the right, as you can see, in Korea has also undermined the historical circumstances directly related to the Korean War. It rushes to underscore the piece at the end of the exhibition of filling more than half of the spaces with the works of famous artists such as Ai Weiwei, Chinese artist work on the Syrian refugees. So it really represents the Korean War as a kind of universal, in relation to the universal human conditions. I will cite the Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, in Memory, History and Forgetting. Ricoeur famously puts it that forgetting designates the unperceived character of the perseverance of memories and their removal from vigilance of consciousness. In a way, the Ricoeur noted the interdependent relationship between remembrance and forgetting. I like to say there's some over tendency to downplay the treacherous nature of the Korean War. Indeed, Korean War continued to be the subject of people's interest, at least among the countries that had participated in the war. You can see the different representations. One on the left is the poster of the films in North Korea during the 1970s. One in the middle on the left is an image of the memorials at Washington nearby. And the third one is the film 태극기 휘날리는, blockbuster film made in South Korea in 2004. On the right is the most recent one, very controversial one, the film Battle at the Shangzhen. So Korean War is remembered, and it is consistent subject of controversy. It is forgotten as it distorts the reality of the war. only celebrating the heroic deeds of the Chinese armies against definitely their enemies. At that time is the UN troops led by the United States militaries. So I will pay attention to the Korean War for its ambivalent status to further explain how it can be both remembered and forgotten. Let me explain the more about this unique conditions. I believed that kind of more prone to both remembrance and oblivion versus Korean War has not ended. We're still in the shadow of truth. So we can't simply forget it. But at the same time, it has ended 70 years ago. So contemporary Korean society cannot keep on just kind of bombarded with this fear. So they have to forget some part of it in order to invest and prosper and to move on. So there's a kind of contradictions there. At the same time, if you know the Korean history, there's a huge and long history of anti-communist social atmosphere, which kind of silenced about a lot of historical details, such as civilian massacre executed during the Korean War. So ambivalence of Korean War corresponds to the dual state of the post-memory generation in Hirsch's theory. I will bring up later. The post-memory generations inherited memory represent both closeness and distance from the tragic memory of the older generation, because the post-memory concept emphasized the next generations who interested in the Korean War try to get in close with this tragic memory. So there's a closeness on the one hand, but at the same time, it has ended. So it's inherited memories that can only access to this historical treasury through secondary sources, just as a blockbuster movies or the stories inherited within the family. So there's a distance. So I considered the unique conditions for the Korean War can be an interesting subject matter for the study of post-memory. This is the book cover image, and these are the themes that I will deal with. So remembrance and forgetting, past and present, truth and imaginary investments, and generational gaps, empathy and psychological distance out of the post-memory generations. And I haven't had a chance to have a talk at the graduate schools, and I explained that as I was writing this book, I began to realize that this kind of post-memory, an inherited concept of memory, can be really common to all, because when I was writing, I just began to remind myself about the whole stories that my grandfather or grandmother had passed on to me. And it's not really specific about any diplomatic condition. It's really about how a lot of the modern nation had undergone, and the old families and or relatives their own history of wars and tragedy. So I think it's really a good way to think about your own family as well. This is a table of contents. First part is about the theoretical background of post-memory generation. And I will bring up this specific historical and cultural circumstances in South Korea in this section 2. And in the third section, I will bring up the 13 great artists and filmmakers. I asked them to join it, but this is really nighttime in South Korea. But please let me just name all these peoples, because these are artists not just dealt with Korean War. There are happen to be the very famous artists in South Korea. 2 or 3 of them actually presented Korean Pavilion at Venice Biennial. And Hung Sun-im, for instance, get the second, the biggest prize from Venice Biennial. So Hung Sun-im, Won Jin-chae, all these artists, I will mention about them. This is the book cover of Marion Hirsch's Post-Memory. There's a lot of theoreticians who talked about post-memory, but I will mention about the Hirsch. Let me read the Hirsch's very famous quote. Post-memory is a powerful form of memory precisely because its connection to its object or source is mediated not through recollection, but through representation, projection, and creation. I was drawn to this concept of imaginary investment, namely arts and writing by the post-memorization is intended to have this exposure to imaginary investment. because the post-memory generation can only access to the history of war through the secondary sources. Therefore, it's valuable and gives a great explanatory frameworks for arts and films created both those who never personally witnessed historical tragedies. So there's a particular historical circumstances for the post-memory generation to talk about the history of war. And the other thing is, one can say that the generations born after the historic tragedies had a relatively least burden of being strictly truthful. It's also important to note that the art is certainly the area that is more open to individual and personal interpretations of historical material, certainly in comparison to history or politics. There's another good aspect of why we kind of wanted to bring up the post-memory and to think about how the generations after this traumatic events have actively pursue and explore those issues of tragedy without really directly experiencing them. In order to see the more detailed characterization among the post-memory generation in South Korea, I referred to Dong-Yeon Koh, the director of unification research at Aji University. He cited the three categories. And this is like grew up, that means it's not born, but rather they were born right before this year, or they were raised or grew up and spent some time in their teens or 20s, around some of the interesting historical events that had taken place. And grew up 1953, the oldest generation can be considered to be like a first generation or 1.5 generation in Hirsch's theory, because first generation is the generation who experienced the war, and 1.5 generation is the generation who witnessed the war but cannot have a full memory of that because they were just born right before the 1953. And the second generation grew up in 1987. This particularly 1987 is something related to the democratization movement that took place in 1980. And 1987 is famous for the June 29th announcement, which considered to be the successful outcome of the democratization movement. So I kind of pay attention to the second generation. These are the post-memory generation because they haven't really experienced the Korean War. But at the same time, this is a generation that developed a very strong critical historical consciousness because they had underwent the democratization movement. So at that time, historical representation, in other words, how you understand the modern Korean history and the birth of Korea as a nation becomes so controversial issue. So that I really pay attention to this middle generation. Most of the artists in the book were born in late 1960s until early 1980s. So they're like a little bit younger generations of this middle generation. And the third generation is the youngest one who grew up in 2019. I think it's just the research which was taking place around this time. So that means just simply saying youngest generation. They have a very different opinions. I was involved with some of the young artists collective who dealing with the image of a Korean division or something. Basically, they consider the North and South Korea as separate. So the obsessing with unification is not the really the perceivable resolution of the current state of a division. But at the same time, they have less interest in historical memories themselves. So I consider that the second middle generations might be the most interesting subject for me, as well as I belong to the second generation. And then I will talk about some of the historical background for artists and filmmakers. This is the image of Jeju Peace Park. The Jeju April 3rd instance, one of the earliest communist huntdown that took place in 1947 and 48, right before the Korean War. And some scholars had tended to consider it as the prelude to the Korean War. And what happens during the late 1990s and 2000 is that the civilian Korean government began to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, through which the government really undertook serious investigation of some of the civilian massacre that took place during the Korean War, and that includes the Jeju April 3rd incidents. And this peace corps was established in 2008, just after investigation has announced, and they kind of come up with approximation of casualty. They also found a huge graveyard of collective victims. So this is also interesting background when the artists began to deal with this historical memories of Korean War during the 2000 and afterward. Another background is on the right, the Hung-Soon Liam's, and he's a documentary photography, and I make it some comparison with the painting, more realistic painting on the left. Unlike the older generation, the younger generation of South Korean artists who actively began working from the 2000s tended to evade, to include more directly violent or destructive images, like on the left, and they kind of tended to not foresee some kind of enemy situation. Like on the left, you see this whole the Korean people trapped in the shackles, and there's a lot of reference to American popular culture, which is certainly constitute the contrast. I mean, this painting is supposed to be really huge. What I'm trying to say, the traditional realist painters in South Korea tended to evoke and provoke the audiences with more violent images. But on the right, as you can see, the younger generation begins to be interested in more traces and remnants of historical memory, rather than provoking the audience with more specific, didactic ways. So let me begin with the table of contents. These are the 5 categories. And this book actually, it's intended for the broader introduction as well. So I put first category of documentary photograph. And second is DMZ. So it's really artists who pursue the placeness of DMZ, history of DMZ, and some of the participatory artistic project. It's like a public art. And third category is documentary films. And fourth is media installation. And fifth is the exhibitions and museums, especially war museums or war memorials. So these are the different categories that dealt with history of Korean War after years of tragic events had happened. On the left is Hung-Soon Liam and his stone, Bromby rocks, and the right is the nameless scenery. I will say the gradual demise of military dictatorship and conservative government in South Korea, most importantly, Committee of Reconciliation, that come out with a more direct historical investigation. And I wrote an article on brief documentary photographers dealing with the post-traumatic moment. The theory of late photography refers to that the dominant tendency in documentary photography. It omits the parts of destructive images, such as the scenes of ruins after the September 11. I mean, documentary theory becomes really popularized, particularly by the David Company, the British photography critic. Let's look at the Hung-Soon Liam's footprint and nameless scenery. Both are taken while Im was filming his work. This is after Committee of Historical and Truth acknowledged the tragic incident and tried to come up with approximate number of over casualties. The government resurrected the graveyard, as I introduced you. Until then, the whereabouts of the victim's corpse had been unknown. Then the producer of the film, now the wife of Im, was also the victim's family, who did not know the graveyard of her grandfather. During the early 2010, Jeju Island became the center of attention as the Korean government planned to establish a neighbor base. Despite the long history of violence and war, the island is still considered as a dear place for the neighbor-based by the government. It's under the Im Young-bak administration. There's a huge demonstration. But if you look at the left, none of the actual trace of violence seems to be evident. It's more of artist's imagination. Now, the fact that the short and deep forest is where the victims tended to flood and executed. Especially, this is a unique types of natural habitat in Jeju Island because the island is so windy. The trees are it's kind of growing in many different directions, and making some kind of labyrinth like a forest, and it really become important inspiration materials for a lot of Korean artists. And in fact, historically, a lot of victims had to fly to this forest in order to escape from the militaries and the postmen's hunt down and investigations during the Jeju April 3rd. So this is a historical too, but you can't really see what's happening. I mean, this is all imaginary. What is interesting thing about this types of traits is that it can provoke the viewer's imagination. Viewer can fill in the blanks. What he said, this is the artist's quote, I will explain that lives of the past are different from the lives of the present. That seems to be the only way of preventing more tragic future, because this kind of force also become popular tourist attraction these days. So by taking the image of this old Jeju Island in a little bit darker way, he wanted to remind us that this very beautiful, unique natural habitat in Jeju Islands happens to be a historic place and tragic place in the past. And this is another one, Won Jun-chae. And I will say it's a framing. His technique is a framing. Won Jun-chae took the photographs of military complexes, bunkers, and other facilities that are no longer in use. Some of them located very close to the area that people are living. You can definitely see the apartment complex in the back, close to the highway or deserted land close to the city. The historical background was the border protection law. This is an agreement between Korean government and U.S. and military forces. On the one hand, the Korean government wanted to develop the northern part of Gyeonggi-do close to the border area. At the same time, American military wanted to relocate some of the forces very close to the borderline to the southern part of Gyeonggi-do, like for safety and changes of their militaristic strategy. And the whole plan has completed, I guess, 2018. So it's almost like more than 20 years it took place to complete the project. And a lot of American military was kind of vacated. And now they're in Pyeongtaek area. It's kind of southern part of Seoul. And these are the stones used to prevent the tank that getting directly heading into Seoul. So you have a lot of stones, small stones in the middle. So the huge, vehicles can't really directly get into the vicinity, the Seoul and vicinity. That had been used during the Korean War, and the bunkers. And the other interesting historical background is certainly the real estate boom. And the government, really, original government particularly boosted the northern part of the area for the developments to build huge apartment complexes and outlet stores. The area nearby military complexes and borderlines has been conceived as too dangerous, so the investment has been far lagging until the early 2000s. But after 2000 and mid-2000, the whole nature of this area has been really, really changed. Here are the two images. One is on the left, is Ujeongbu. Ujeongbu is really famous. If you go to Ujeongbu these days, you can see a lot of big apartment complexes. The apartment stores actually is there one of the biggest outlets in the Paju and the northern out of the Paju area, which used to be considered to be really kind of deserted and dangerous area for investment in the past. And what's interesting thing about this photograph is the juxtaposition of a foreground and a background. So you can see that these remnants are very small, ignoble, yet still exist, really right there in the middle of our in the middle of our apartment complexes. Finally, Soo Young-yu is a rare female documentary photographer in South Korea. She usually took photographs of North Korean expatriates, and because she was actually working as an English teacher for these schools for children whose families coming from the north, what we call like 탈북자, or North Korean defectors and expatriates. I will pay attention to this particular photograph because it's collage image. She went to the Incheon Park where this very famous MacArthur statue is standing. And these young couple, I think the brother and sister, who ran into the statue and took pictures of it. And the photographer was certainly very, very surprised because Koreans definitely not pay attention to this statue. It's one of the statues considered to be very ugly, very unpopular. The city of Incheon constantly changed the locations of the statue because younger generations certainly not interested in it. So the photographer is really surprised that this North Korean expatriates kind of running to and taking pictures in front of the MacArthur. I think it's probably because that's really the historic figure that they're familiar with, while the rest of the younger generation is not really interested in MacArthur. And she took a picture of the artist Yoon, took a picture of dam taking pictures of MacArthur. So it's kind of combined collage image. So one area is that she took a picture of the dam, and they took a picture of statue, MacArthur. So you really wanted to see how two different perspectives coexisting toward this one historic figure, particularly the very important figure during the Korean War. So lay photography in South Korea have found new possibilities in capturing fragments of reality precisely by not trying to carry the full narrative of already incomplete and forgotten historical materials. Tasks vacant military facility, oftentimes just abandoned. We don't know exactly the purpose of it. We just assume the purpose of this defunct military facility, and Yoon's treatment of defectors refused to explicitly depict and define the victims of given historical materials and events. You can criticize it. We can come back with a question and answer session, but at the same time, this photographic style is thus useful in implying the layered historical circumstances for remembering, as well as, for that matter, for forgetting about historical wounds in post-war South Korean society without confining the history of violence into political rhetoric and shocking images. Because some of the Koreans are really familiar with it. The politicians always use this very shocking images to provoke the people's fear. So this is really kind of opposite strategy. And the second chapter is about the places of DMZ. While documentary photographs dealt with indexical marks, I will move to the site of DMZ as the symbolic place for the dual circumstances of remembrance and forgetting. The DMZ has been the major part of tourism related to the Korean War. At the same time, how the place has been used as a part of a tourist policy around the borderline area tells the very ambivalent meanings of Korean War and post-war South Korean society. As you can see on the left, DMZ has been interpreted as the place for, eulogized for the natural habitat and the symbol of peace. And I can't believe that it's in DMZ. I think that someone actually borrowed the image from Europe. You see that if you look at it really closely, it's kind of European peak type of mountains. I like that. As you can see on the left, and then we can call it as ecotourism, important transition from security tourism that emphasize the history of militaristic conflicts in the region. I like this image, which looks like European hiking trails and famous tourist attraction. Indeed, as I have discussed in the previous section, the border protection law made the regional tourism in the DMZ area or prosper and expedited. DMZ is the most visited place among international tourists. And the government established the 평화 work, so the peace work and peace trail and peace park in that area. Some of the romantic comedy has to show this place, and I can definitely see that. Yemen also has this DMZ. Not anymore, but especially in the early 2010s when the Peace Park and the trail was open. The famous drama of Inheritor's Son, 태양의 후예들, right, was also shot in one of defunct American camps, Camp Graves, the defunct American military complex. So these popular culture used in a way to boost the economy. I think Lee also has some very interesting DMZ program, was so unpopular, so it's shut down. But there's a definitely interaction. It's important to think about the peaceful future of Korean Peninsula as best captured in the image of DMZ. The place of DMZ is, however, is far from benign. Although the DMZ being the buffering zone is occupying neither military forces other than that for the purpose of self-protection, but there has been all kinds of conflicts. The JSN, one of the earliest film that dealt with this DMZ. This is kind of really fantastic place for a lot of peoples in their imaginations. And most importantly, however, there's a serious landmine problem because a lot of last fierce battles during the Korean War took place and just right in this area. So there's huge landmines still buried in this area. But against such authoritative approach toward the DMZ, either the place of treasury or safe haven for animals, artists had to put their efforts to bring their own interesting interpretation. The annual art event, the Rear DMZ project, took place from the early 2000s. First example is Ha-Yun Hwang's Rear work. I think she's living in France. The work effectively conveys the dual image of DMZ. You can hear the narration based upon the interview of soldiers guarding the DMZ. On the one hand, it is beautiful and quiet. And narration actually tells you, but you can constantly hear the sounds of explosion. You can see the boom, boom, boom sound whenever the animals step on the landmines. The title 489 is originated from one expert saying that it will take much more than such as 489 years to get rid of all the landmines buried in DMZ. And this just really interesting work because it looks like game. It's very clean and very serene atmosphere. And there's a narration of the soldiers guarding at the GOP. And one interesting comments that made by the soldier is that they really enjoy this beautiful scenery, but at the same time, they should be really extremely careful just to follow the footsteps made on the ground to make sure they not step on the landmines. So it's kind of, they themselves actually express their envious feeling. They really like, because there's nobody there, so it's really clean, but at the same time, they should be really careful on the ground. Otherwise, you don't know what's going to happen at the next minute. In criticizing the prevailing image of DMZ, I also utilized the theory of Auge's anthropological space. Auge is a very famous French philosopher and sociologist, emphasized the process of defining a particular place not based upon the outsider's perspective, but from the insider's perspective, namely community space. I choose Youngju Cho and Jisun Shin's work. They collaborate with the local residents, what we call the community, if you can still believe there's some types of community in the DMZ area. For instance, Youngju Cho worked with the local female farmers, also serving as a tourist guide in the region. In her interview, the farmers and tourist guides talked about the serenity of the region, and yet, as you can see, the sign of danger was certainly stood up there. It's kind of installed everywhere, contradicting with the image of middle-aged women enjoying her outfit and fantasizing their momentum. This is far from being the place for happiness. Jisun Shin has also collaborated with the soldiers guiding the GOP General Outpost and let the local owner and the stationary patch makers to create the patches of animals and plants. If someone actually go to the military, know how the young soldiers really like to collect. There's a lot of patches. These not official. If you look at some of it, looks like a very Disney type, but these animals are the animals that can be found inside the DMZ, and she collaborated with the soldiers to create this image. And then it's really soldable and it's collectible. Actually, it's sold also in our museum in Seoul. So there's a lot of play around this kind of idealized image of DMZ. The final work is Min-Hook Lim. Her Monument 300 it's really about participatory art project happening in the region of Cheongnam, very close to the DMZ. Lim worked with the Rumors of Area Waterwork Center. Marian Hirsch, mentions that the arts and writings of the post-memory generation drew their inspiration from least reliable and secondary sources such as rumors. And certainly there's a rumors related to the Waterwork Center. According to the Korean government, North Korean army kept 300 South Korean civilians, then they tortured and killed them. But according to one victim's daughter, the civilians were adapted as they were mostly engineers and other professionals who might be conceived as beneficial to the North Korean army. So out of a research and interview, Lim, the artist, hypothesized that there might be some bleeding marks kept underneath this area. So it's kind of imaginary circumstances. Upon the arrival of the site of Waterwork Center, participants were given portable flashlights and they could make out transparent watermarks in the middle. This is really not really, it's very beautiful if you see from the rear images, but it's still not easily recognizable. The watermarks are made of transparent epoxy and placed on the ground. In reality, however, it's almost impossible for participants to spot these small ignoble markers on the snowy ground in a really cold weather. The terrain is very notorious for the cold weather. Here, what I will call is to dynamic nature of finding historical traces, even if these are fictional ones. How can such an emphasis on the process opening to new potentials for the post-memory generations, the very relationship with historical tragedies? Post-memory's connection to the past remains fragmentary and secondary, yet the achievement of younger generation rests upon their investment, projection, and creation. I borrowed this expression from Marian Hirsch's book, and their attempt to reconstruct historical tragedies. Lim's participatory project evolves on the audience's search for imagined historical evidence created by the artist himself. The first chapter deals with the photographers looking for the traces, and second chapter deals with the artists involving ordinary Koreans with the process of searching the historical marks around the DMZ. The third chapter is more directly related to the real personal tragedies and family history, particularly filmmakers themselves. As I mentioned earlier, one source of forgetting or historical oblivion relates to the Korean War in South Korea is historical context of anti-communism. For instance, Jae Hee-hong on the left, my father's email revolves around her father who came from the north to the south right before the outbreak of the war. But in South, his wife's cousin was involved with Dong-Yeon. It's a very notorious civilian massacre, another anti-communist junta by the South Korean government during the Korean War. Since wife's cousin was sacrificed during the Dong-Yeon, this father of Hong Jae-hee, director, was also classified as the group of suspicious people by the Korean government. Thus, he has endured his entire life the surveillance and social discrimination accorded upon the suspicious people, because he is he doesn't really like the North because he escaped from the North Korea, but he ended up hate South Korea too. So he wants to go to Australia, but he can't emigrate because he was considered to be suspicious people. So, but I will come back with the tragic circumstances of him on the left. But on the right is director Yang Yong-hee. The film Dear Pyongyang won the prizes from Sundance Film Festival and Berlin Film Festival. Yang's father was a pro-North Korean known as a Cho Chong-young, living in Japan. He sent to the North Korea 3 older sons or 3 older brothers. If you can see, Yang Young is the youngest girl in the middle, and you see 3 older brothers. As a part of the repatriation project in the early 1970s, North Korean government invited the Koreans living in Japan to give the full citizenship because, as you can see, South Koreans or North Koreans, Koreans living in Japan were not entitled to have the citizenship until now. So they have to really face with all kinds of social discriminations. So his father actually decided to send all 3 sons to the North. But in both circumstances, both fathers kept their silences. As I told you, his father wants to leave South Korea, but he couldn't. So he can't leave the country. But throughout all his life, he emotionally shut himself from the rest of the family. Tae-young opened the emails from her father almost 7 months after his death. So there's a lot of confusion, lack of information. These scenes is in which the Tae-hong, the daughter, accidentally spot her father's luggage, but definitely she couldn't open it. So on the way to the locksmith, it just automatically opened. But that was kind of symbolic way of the relationship between father and daughter. Thus, the documentary deals with the Hong's process of tracking down his father's life, his inner minds, not limiting himself to find the factual account of his life. But there's also a lot of incidents where she really expressed the frustration. In the same way, Yang's father rarely reveals his inner minds to the daughter. Any problematic opinion might jeopardize the safety of his sons in the North. He kept a picture of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il throughout his life in his house. He never answered Yang's question whether he regretted of sending his 3 sons to the North. Of course, if you look at the documentary, 3 sons are terribly, terribly unhappy. And one of the sons died due to the depressions, but all of them really looks really unhappy. And one of the recurring and dominant images were his back shot from behind. Yang's father passed away while she was filming, and he was not able to say at the later part of the film due to her disease, but there's a lot of moments that he never answered the questions. And there's a long story. Therefore, my father's emails, Dear Pyongyang, shows the process through which the post-memory generation investigates a nation's tragedy through their personal history. And both films revealed a post-memory generation's frustration over the lack of communication with the older generation. And the films really dealt with not just the father, but more about these filmmakers, the daughter's ways of coming to terms with the tragic experience of his father's generation. And the ending was also tragic in a way in both films because Hong Jae's the father really had a terrible relationship with the rest of the family, and the rest of the family, deny and doesn't want to reconcile his father. According to Hirsch, the mechanism of post-memory is predicated upon the delay and gap between historical memories and artifacts, which emerged as a key trait of the post-memory generation's artworks. Indeed, both my father's emails and Dear Pyongyang proves how difficult and confusing and limited the process of reconciliation between the first generation and the generations after the war might be. While emotional aspects of family treasury loom large, the next chapters would deal with the really emotional affected memories. how artists can emotionally provoke the post-memory generation audiences, how the non-visual elements of senses, such as sounds and smells, can be used to achieve such effects. The first one is Chung Ju-an. Work with the sounds. Specifically, he used the sounds from the war movies, like a 태극기비는 in all blockbuster movies, because we don't know exact sounds of wars during the Korean War. So he made up out of what we call the secondary sources. And then he helped the dancers, all wearing the very contemporary clothing, to dance, listen to these sounds first, and then perform while imagining the last moments of those victims during the war. Your first one is a huge sound effects. Audience can hear this very huge banging sound before they're standing in front of this horizontal expanded screen. I mean, usually the scale is really huge and very overwhelming. And the other thing is there's a really individual interpretations. They're really different from each other. One female dancer is just circling around. The other, the male kind of tended to make some narrative, like, initially the Tom Duan explained that some people really wanted to follow some Hollywood-like arc, like, it's like, it's showing their love of the family. So there's a really different interpretations of these last moments. In the same way, so this kind of post-memory, imaginary investment. In the same way, Tae-wook Lee used the voice of narrator to read the letters of student soldiers, which is currently in the collection of National War Memorials at Yongsan. Let me read this. There are many. This is a letter written by 13 and 14-year-old student soldiers. There are many. We are only 71 people. I'm afraid what is going to happen. I feel a little calm because I feel I'm talking to you, Mom. I want to go back to you when the war is over and call you Mom. It's really heartbreaking, as the letter was found inside his corpse, found the next day of his death. While the narrator reads the letter, he wrote electronic equipment, which records the fluctuation of his brain waves. This voice narrator is just a contemporary figure. He was a crying in the climactic moment at the graphic lines, definitely rapidly fluctuating. According to the Chinese critic Jiang Xin, Tae-wook Lee's work treats his narrators, and for that matter, the audiences, as not only subject who express emotions, but also object being measured and observed, because really we're observing him, the voice narrator, actually crying and changing voice and express and sometimes overwhelmed by emotions. In emphatic audition, the scanned images of narrator's brain on the screen help the audience witness how the narrator's brains and bodies react to emotional stimuli. The last work from this chapter is Dong-Yeon Koh. His installation of H's barber shop used a smell, or properly speaking, the over a smell, enclosed atmosphere, and mumbling sounds. Used the creams and other chemical materials, objects belonging to the older generation to create an atmosphere that reminds their generations of war veterans. Here, Park introduced smells not just to represent a particular message, but also to construct an atmosphere that can use scents to disturb the audiences because it's really stuffy. It's made of the small boxes. The unfamiliar and stuffy smells and atmosphere inside the H's barber shop may remain foreign to some young visitors. The exhibitions also took place in 2017, the height of the protest calling for the step down of the President Park Geun-hye, the symbol of older generation's history. If you know some of the 태극기 there, you can find everything on the right. And the exhibition took place at the Seoul Seoul Museum of Art, which is very close to the Gwanghwamun. So you can't miss it. And so the symbol of older generation history and nostalgia, thus the uncomfortable atmosphere, the 태극기 located inside the barber shop, and old man's mumbling. And as you see the screen, and old man's mumbling is really referenced back to the student soldier, his years in the student soldier, resonate with the marginalized social and political conditions of the older generation, especially in the minds of younger generations of South Koreans visiting the exhibition. And so it's not really what I'm saying, it's not representative. They're not really represent the smells of the war. It's more like evocative, provoke the audiences to think about it, what really happened, what kind of distance, generational difference means to them, how uncomfortable the smells atmosphere is. In the final chapter, I look into the cases, 3 cases of artists organized exhibitions. This chapter deals with wounded soldier's body and missing corpse sacrificed during the Korean War as a new site or immaterial new subject to rethink about the traditional memorials and exhibitions at War Museum. Hong Soon-im's Homecoming Box was the rare example dealing with the Korean soldiers coming back from the Vietnam War. The South Korea sent the second biggest troops to the Vietnam War next to the US. But during the early 2000s, repressive history of South Korean soldiers' violent deeds at the Vietnam War has covered by Hungary. And the Kim Il-jung president has apologized for it, and then there's a lot of controversy surrounding the Vietnam War veterans in South Korea. At the same time, the veterans also posed problems with the defoliant Agent Orange because of a lot of the problem with the skin disease and everything. Hong Soon-im's Homecoming Boxes organized at this complicated time for Korean veterans of the Vietnam War. And you can see these images. Let me read what the artist says. Rather than the letters appear on the surface of celluloid plate, the letters recorded underneath the photograph can be closer to the truthfulness of memory. So you kind of get into the personal and material culture of these veterans that had not been really explored until then. And particularly, we have to pay attention to this image. I can show you on the right and the middle, the soldier lost one leg. It's really uncommon to reveal the wounded body in public. Therefore, I can read this very shocking reference. This is the interview. A short dream of K, this Mr. K who lost a leg. That's about the physical things like legs, because I have only one leg. Well, what should I say? In my dream, I have both legs and just went somewhere, something like that. When I woke up, I found myself having only one leg. After awaking, all was in vain, for it's just a daydream, and became concerned about my real life. What's interesting thing is, he made it in public. That's really rare thing. Erica Dawes has claimed that it's not uncommon to expose the image of disabled soldiers in public. Official depiction of war heroes in memorials consciously avoids revealing the pathological state of these soldiers. The last image is from the exhibition at the National Museum of Korean History. The special exhibition, Bring Them Home, or in Korean, Returning Home in 67 Years at the National Museum of Korean History, further calls our attention to the new way of representing death. That is to reveal absent and vacant burial pits and to attract the public's attention to the forgotten and obscured issues of missing corpses in South Korea. There's a whole history, but the total number of casualties of South Korean soldiers reaches more than 130,000, but less than 1% of missing corpses had been found so far. And there's a whole list of it, but so far, 142 bodies had been identified and returned to the National Cemetery. It's a very low percentage. But on the top of it, the family rarely report their DNA. A, because they don't think it's possible, but B, they have a long history of doubt that whenever they spotted the corpse in some weird area, they can consider to be betrayer, deserter, or pro-communist, etc. So it's got very, very low, very tragic circumstances. Returning to the exhibition, the ground pit at the Bring Them Home appears as a kind of theater through which the audience can imagine the complicated historical social context behind the absent bodies. Along with the constructed P on the right, the audience can also see the military ID tags and necklaces. I mean, there's a lot of materials you can find it, but they can't find the body, basically. In Bring Them Home, the LED light delineating the silhouette of imaginary dead body of the soldier onto the plastic cast of the corpse-shaped object. And this is a blinking inside the constructed P, where the body is supposed to be buried. The LED sign in a way revokes the fact that the body is absent, as the lightning is consistently flickering, yet never appears to be permanent and stable. At the same time, the burial site that emphasize the absence of that body remind the audience of the shifted role of memorials. According to the young James Young, very famous anthropologist, the new generations of artists and architects prefer to take amorphous shapes that emphasize the openness. In an increasingly democratic age in which the stories of nations are being told in the multiple voices of its everyday historian, its individual citizens' monolithic meanings and national narrative are as difficult to pin down as they may be nostalgically known for. Reserved has been a shift away from the notion of national collective memory to what I'd call the nation's collective memory. So many different memories existing. Therefore, I argue that contemporary arts and films for the last 2 decades have shown how the Korean War has been used not so much to recover the forgotten historical facts alone, but also to see how those traces have been repressed or somewhat deliberately forced or sometimes abandoned, such as military bunkers, ecotourism, DMZ, by different social groups. When these images might not directly portray or show the violent history of Korean War, they demonstrate how post-war Korean society and people has dealt with the memory of Korean War, as well as, despite all this historical oblivion, its continued presence in contemporary Korean society. Thank you.
All right, so we already received 3 questions via Zoom, so we'll cover that, but we will also take questions from the audience here in the room. Okay, any questions from the audience? Yes, because I know you have to leave, so yeah. Could you please identify yourself when you're asking questions? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Jung-Shu Lee, and actually I'm teaching Korean art and then the East Asian art at GW. So thank you so much for your very informative and inspirational artists. All these artists are amazing job. So my question is, so you said it seems like these artists might be the second generation, the middle generation. And then I'm just curious about the resources. I mean, where they encounter all this, even though that's very kind of secondary, secondhand information, but maybe there is a war museum or national history museums and things like, or maybe direct from their grandparents. So all these diverse, and maybe you did an interview with an artist. So how deeply they could receive our influence so that they can do creative, injection and production, to create this work. That's my first question. The second question is particularly interested in government position for that, because as far as I know, the war-related work of art were not exhibited that much until very recently, until Moon's president, National Gallery of Art and big mega exhibition about the Korean War. So what about the is there kind of mega exhibition about that? What about the government support about this circulation of images and resources? Thank you.
Answer to the first question is that I'm really close to these artists. I've been actually working with these years and years, more than some of them are very close friends of mine, more than 10 years. Ironically, they research a lot. they research a lot. So I'm actually talking about the distance because there's a post-memory generation. That means their memories, their encounter is a secondary, but at the same time, they work a lot. For instance, Hyung-Soo visited the military archives in the US, all over the world to check out old photographs. But rather than taking images directly or borrowing images from this military archive, he kind of went into this interviews. Because I showed just the photographs, but he was documentary filmmakers. And also he published a lot of photographs as a part of photographic books. It shows his process of research, so they know a lot. Number two is that, for instance, the Weird DMZ project, in order to participate this yearly, it's very important. It becomes prestigious or event in South Korea. You have to get through the process of artist residency. So they have to meet with the local historian. They also has a architecture historian. So they get to know about this history actually better than the ordinary people as well as ordinary community of artists. So there's a distance, but also they put a lot of efforts. What I'm trying to say through this research, they're not just to just represent what they know about it. It's more like they kind of become more critical and as well perceptive in deconstructing. And we got the history of Waterworks Center in Mona, and then he kind of went into the family directly, get the oral history to the sideway of the official information they can get. And then they went into the relationship with the family, make up the story. So there's additional efforts, and I really like this imagine investment. What is a creative process, which is only possible in the fields of art. You can't do it as a historian, right? As a rumor is a fun thing. So that's on and on. That's just something that I can talk about it. Answer to your second question. I think it's not necessarily government takes particular position these days. Korean art world, the Korean society list becomes sophisticated. That list pretends to be sophisticated. In other words, Koreans are really very control their own opinions before the governments actually get in the way. So in a way, the Korean artists also do some self-censorship. That's more like important concept you have to think about it before saying government doesn't want this or kind of interrupt. That's not going to be happening so much. The artists just not let that happen. But like a lot of South Korean people, still Korean artists also not going so deep. So they wanted to play around a lot of concept that is allowable. But also the other thing about the recent exhibition in commemoration of the break of the Korean War, it's like an MMCA exhibition in the National Museum, and also the other exhibitions, and Pyongyang exhibitions where the Taeyong Park's installations appear. That's actually both exhibitions under the more progressive government. I'm kind of take the critical position for either conservative and progressive government. I don't think the progressive government is more open to directly deal with the tragic history. I think the governments are pretty much saying of not trying to include so tragic image in the art museum. Yeah, this on and on. There's a differences between art museum and history museum, but obviously it's more likely the Korean government or the artist trying to not really step on the really controversial images. That's also his, the cultural atmosphere there too. So I don't want to say that any government really brave enough to stop or step into area. And that's what I think about. Even the politician, progressive intellectuals are a little bit hypocritic.
Thank you. Well, it's it's interesting to learn that. Either liberal or conservative governments are all like trying not to portray this tragic images of the Korean War.
Because the especially progressive government kind of vague about it. For instance, we see the ecotourism because they don't want to kind of provoke North Korea to So in a way, they have their own position of not doing it. In the same way, conservative government also not doing it because their own position for domestic, very conservative voters, right? I mean, yeah.
All right, thank you. So let me ask a question from online. So this is a question from Olvina. What was the turning point catalyst for South Korea to turn the remnants of the Korean War into tourist attraction art? It's understandable that Korean shouldn't be held back by the events of the war, but what enabled them to turn this once painful event into a source of something greater in such a short time?
Yes, I mean, I'm not that much like historian of diplomatic or political controversy related to the representation of Korean War, but I can say overall, because Korean, even back to the Routledge administration, which kind of began to prepare for the border protection law, they wanted to have a good relationship with China first. So this is all, think about it. I mean, so they always care about their relationship with China and North Korea, despite the fact that the conservative politicians kind of very mantras about their relationship with North Korea. In the end, I don't think they are really that much because you have to deal with the whole the dynamics within the region. So I will say once South Korea become more conscious about the Koreans' economy relations with China, I mean, the border sense, as well as understanding. I mean, it's really, really, really difficult issues. Nobody can really answer it. But based upon my reading, that kind of beginning of the South Korean government try to be kind of work with the communist government and never really doing it for totally a diplomat, the militaristic concerns. I think then the government is actually fluctuating. The interesting thing is that either Kun Bok administration and the Dong-Yeon administration both wanted to get a lot of investors to the northern part of Gyeonggi-do because Gyeonggi-do is the second largest area for the population in South Korea, and that's a very limited area in the southern part of Seoul. You have a Pundang area, which is really stark contrast with some of the economic conditions in the region during the early 2000s. So they really kind of try to bring a lot of investors to the northern part of Seoul. So there's also domestic economy concerns. So I think it's combined. So they're pretending they're really against North and China, but in economic sense, in reality, I think they have to kind of play around with these images, not to make, yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you. So it's kind of related to what you just mentioned. It sounded like the change we see in the how people appreciate the Korean War is more kind of shaped by the government policy rather than how people think differently about over generations. So do you think? So you mentioned the government have different policies about how they view China or North Korea, and that's has some work towards kind of regulations to what kind of work can be in the museums and so on. So do you think we'll see government policy driving that kind of move towards more neutral representation of the Korean War, or do you think there's kind of underlying change in terms of how people see the Korean
War? Because I have to talk about the government's role. In the end, this whole information related to historical treasuries or some information in DMZ, it used to be the part of military information, so that it's not the information in the private sector. For instance, some of the areas that becomes a part of the peace park or peace trail used to belong to the military area. It's not forbidden. So I think the military or the governments has to play important roles to let these area occupied by some artistic events, or the artists begin access to this information. That's the first level of government in the role, not necessarily intervention, but also this anti-communist textbook or materials. It's really common to the generations of this people, the artists who grew up in 1987. So there's a government role. But I'm not saying governments ask you, the artists, to do this and do that. It's not really happening for a long time. You know, artists actually constantly protested against. So this, if that happens, it becomes really controversial. If it's the government, or it's not a government, it's the government officials or some curators of the public institution ask the artist to withdraw certain work. We call it censorship. Then the artists really protest. It's not that happens so frequently, but as I told you, maybe artists themselves become careful of not to deal with certain things. For instance, North Korean flag is not allowed in public, but artists had a lot of artworks dealing with North Korean flags. But sometimes they cover it on the opening day, and then in the non-profit small art gallery, definitely they exhibit it. But in a public place, they refrain it, or they just get rid of it from the series. I mean, so they're doing it. So that's I'm not so sure it's government interventions, but there's something into it. It's also part of the Korean society, because the government has actually given a lot of money for artists to produce works and have an exhibition, and the public museums participated in international biennials with the public money. It's not censorship in a direct way, but if so many Koreans know it, they don't like it, and gradually they're not the part of the community. So the Korean artist knows how to deal with the circumstances. So yeah, that's one example.
Right, thank you. Now next we have a question from Hyunjae Kim. He's a student studying heritage and memory in UK. It's a question about the scope that you apply the concept of post-memory. So it seems that the concept of post-memory is generally about visual arts and writings of familial connections or kinships of the Holocaust survivors. But I'm very impressed with your study to deal with wider scope of people who remember the Korean War. Could you share your insight of how the concept of post-memory can be dealt with by the wider groups rather than only descendants of the survivors? Who do you think the generation of post-memory in terms of the Korean War? There might be possible discussions about this.
Right. Let me introduce the most recent paper and the project that I did. I wrote about Dong-Yeon Koh. Dong-Yeon Koh was a representative artist for Korean Pavilion at Venice Biennial 2 years before, and she was adoptee of Denmark. What's interesting thing is that she, of course, come back to Jeju Island, where she was believed to be the part of it. And then she later tracked down and found out that her grandfather was a victim of Jeju April 3rd massacre. So there's a lot of interesting things going on. And I joked about the Hirsch never write about the post-memory generational interaction and through the concept of shaman, because her grandfather was a shaman himself, was a male shaman. So the shaman, the student of her grandfather, did the ritual through which this artist, who was raised in Denmark for decades and decades, come back in her 30s to meet her grandfather through this shamanistic ritual. So obviously there's kind of a geographical expansion in terms of diaspora. The other thing is that I think unlike the Holocaust, the Korean War is something that is still going on because it's a really not necessarily we are having war all the time, but any coverage related to there's a small tiny bit conflicts here and there. It's a part of our history. So unlike the Holocaust, maybe the Korean War, the memories of Korean War is continued part of the post-war Korean life. So there's another interesting aspects of the scope of a post-memory generation and that idea of inherited memory. Yeah,
Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Sono Kim. I am a first year student at this US school. I'm part of the MA program, Summer Art International Fair. My question is, as far as I recall, when I was a middle school student, one of our school mission or school trip was to go to the DMZ and see what's going on there and learn about the history. And the main, if I remember correctly, the main purpose of it is to remember what happened back in the day and also for the future unification, like any potential unification. And also, I think the main purpose of the trip was like that. And also, I remember on the TV we kept seeing the arranged meeting between the separated family during the Korean War. So that was kind of helping me to understand the emotional involvement between the families. But nowadays, I'm curious, like how people even get involved emotionally in this post-Korean War situation. And I'm curious if there's any activity going on in middle school, high school student, or that, because I think to remember those tragedy, I think those kind of activity has to be done in a way, like not only like go there and see actually what happened there, but I think part of it is having this art exhibition about it. But I'm just curious what's going on there because I didn't know.
right. Right, I don't know anything about what kind of education they'll get, but obviously Jisuki might be, my generations. Of course, the younger generation in South Korea no longer should read the books about ideology during the summer break to write reviews, like review and stuff. They no longer has to do that. If you read a book, there's a research saying that among the high school students or middle school students, only small percentage, like a 20%, you have to read a book. I can't remember exact data. Only a really small fraction, like 20-30%, actually less than remember, knows the when Korean War broke out. So zero. Their knowledge is actually zero, and the situation is more moving to that direction. And as I told you, I was involved with the younger generations of artists collective called the Bundan Image Center. That means a center for divided image. And one of their ideas is that the obsession with the unification is wrong term. That's not going to be happening. North and South Korea is a separate nation. So they consider the North Korea is no longer enemy. I think it's pretty much strong among the younger generations. I don't know the personal memories or personal reaction to it. I think it's more likely moving into that directions. So that's why I choose the second generation, because the generations of artists who were grown up with this memory of democratization movement and very brainwashed sort of anti-communist education materials tended to be more interested in historical representation compared to the younger generation who wants to do in a very different way. They're kind of more deconstructing. Sometimes it can be more problematic too sometimes because they don't know the history at all. But let's see what will happen. But definitely there are some changes. Yeah. I mean, it's real now that the younger generation is not really interested in unification because it's a two different nation anyway, and why you should unify that.
Actually, I have a related question related to emotional aspect because I'm very much interested in this emotions and affect. And I notice you have a chapter on affective memory, which I find it to be, really interesting. So I appreciate how you're not just looking at visual images, but also this, the affect aspect of memory as well, or the reconstruction of memory through affect. What impact do you think this, affect has in reconstructing the memory of the Korean War? So I'm just curious as to what's your take on this. So for example, it's just simply, inherited memory versus affective memory. What different impact do you think it has?
There are many different things. So I didn't really respond to the Isan Gajo, but Lim In-min, who did some participatory project in the second chapter, right, the Monument 300, she actually did the series of project for Isan Gajo before this work. So there's just something about it. And then I was interested in Jaeyoung work because the box and stuffy smells and with the Taegukgi Buddha thing, because it's not so much just directly related to the Korean War, but this whole combination of Taegukgi Buddha, who happens to be like 1/4 generation, they have a very strong antipathy toward North Korea because they know they are the North Korea's enemy. And then you have this very generations of young people who's not who's less interested in the Korean War, but also doesn't like the Taegukgi Buddha. So this is what I'm saying is affective thing. I don't know how to say about in an emotional way because I'm not a psychologist. I can't really prove anything. But I'm saying is this affective thing really kind of opens up the horizon to deal with very contemporary issues. That's what I really like about the Jaeyoung Park's work. It's about Korean War because all materials are related to the Korean War, but it's a timing. And so the affective emotional reaction, it's not just about sadness. It's really about how to shape the people. Because in South Korea, especially younger generation, the whole idea is I don't want to disturb by this conflict. So that's also the thing. I don't want to be involved with this idea. But suddenly, something Korean War and Taegukgi, image of Taegukgi, and as well as the Songjokgi, is the American flag. It's not just about the older generation. It's really about the war, division, diplomatic conflict, and how the older generation used the current political discourse in relation to their own different understanding of Korean history, Korean War. Because in the end, either like really informed or uninformed, just the emotional reaction to the history of Korean War is related to how each generation think about identity of Korean too. So that's my take. I'm not so sure about how much I kind of get into affected in terms of psychology, human brain. It's not that much my field. It's more like a humanities studies person. So I really like the people's really touches upon it too. That's why I'm interested.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Is there any question from the audience? Okay, if not, I think we'll take from Zoom. So a question from Sophia Han. Do you think this art remembering the Korean War changes the way different generations of South Koreans view North Korea as well as South Korean relations with North Korea? And if so, in what way?
I will say it's more likely the reflection of each generation rather than changing. But at least, for instance, through this art exhibition, and it was an artist talk, which is happening in South Korea. The generational differences can't be understood because we rarely talk about Korean War and how they think differently. But I visit the Bundang Energy Center and I begin to interact with the younger generations. So it's not really changing each one's perspective, but at least to know better. So it's really kind of important platform for discussions, but I don't know exactly how it will change because it's also in the end about diplomatic militaristic conditions. Whenever we talk about Korean War, like it's up to the whole, militaristic conditions. So it's a good platform for conversation because it's really sometimes it's really frustrating. Yeah, because the Korean didn't sign up for the truce agreement, so the way of annulling or changing the set of truce is not between South Korea and North Korea. It's between other countries like China and North Korea and the US who really signed up the treaty. That's another really interesting thing about South Korea constantly being very frustrated. Yeah, that's what the intellectuals often say. We're really awkward situation that we can't make any decisions about our destiny. So that's another thing you have to consider.
Thank you so much. We are out of time, so sorry. We could not address all the questions asked online, but I hope our audience enjoyed our Q&A session. I forgot to mention at the beginning, but today Dr. Sandra Park was supposed to be moderating this talk, but she wasn't feeling well, and so she couldn't make it today. So, but I want to thank her for volunteering to moderate this talk with Dr. Koh. She's the Korean War expert, so that's one of the reasons why she was going to be moderating. But anyways, I'm sure you enjoyed the presentation today. Please join me in thanking Dr. Koh. Thanks to those of you who came in person and hope to see you in our future events. And also thank you so much for our audience who joined online. We have another talk coming up this Wednesday by Professor Kyuk Shin from Stanford. So hopefully you'll be able to make it. Thank you.